Hello everyone. As of this Friday, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution still reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." So, how does this legal principle, at the core of our founding document, stand up to the actual laws in this country? The two portions of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution which I will be discussing here are freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. These are two extremely important things, both in the fact that based on the non-aggression axiom, they are inalienable rights, and that in order to have a functional democracy, it is essential that each citizen be able to make their voice heard and be able to assemble with their fellow citizens for political action. Otherwise, it's simply oligarchy with a democratic face, a false democracy. So, whether we are libertarians or we are simply in favor of a functional democracy, this right is essential. So how does it stand up, and what are the big threats to it? Well, to give you a hint on how this works, do any of you perchance remember the protests outside the Republican National Convention in 2008? Or, likewise, outside the Democratic National Convention in 2008? Let me give you a hint. The protests had to stay within what were known as free speech zones. Now, under the Constitution, and under any rational theory of how the world should work, the entire United States is a free speech zone. However, if someone protested or said anything that could be interpreted as protest outside of the confines of a free speech zone, they faced arrest. The ACLU had to deal with tons of these sorts of things. There were also similar things with questioning police actions, all sorts of nonsense under which protesters were intimidated by police. For instance, Amy Goodman, host of Democracy Now! And one of the greatest journalists of our time, in my opinion, was arrested for pointing out that a police officer's action was unconstitutional while she was protesting. And then there was the example of, prior to the protests, planners of peaceful protests were arrested because they were suspected of incitement to riot. This is how our government, of course, treats the politically active. And then that just happens to be one of the more high-profile examples, because everyone focuses on the national conventions of our two major political parties, thanks to the bipartisan duopoly on power, but we're not going to get into that. But it happens for all sorts of protests. In order to protest in anywhere visible anymore, you need to get a permit, and the application for permits requires legalese, and in many cities, getting a permit is not something where it's just you have to fulfill the proper applications. It's left at the discretion of bureaucrats. It's not guaranteed regardless. So, in other words, free speech and free assembly have gone from inalienable right to a privilege to be earned at the discretion of bureaucracy. Brilliant! That's gonna work great. So many things associated with a good, proper protest are such that they can only be done with a permit now. And unfortunately, the way the permit process works, it's made and designed so that you can only do the protest if it's going to have minimal disruption of anything, which minimizes the effectiveness. In other words, the law is stacked against political change by mass action. That is very bad and is very disenfranchising to those who want to participate in this democracy, or should I say this fake democracy, as Naomi Wolf alleges in her book. I forget which book it was. Oh, Give Me Liberty, yes. And so, there are all these different filters that prevent protests. free speech zones when the entire United States should be a free speech zone, requiring permits to assemble, basically lowering your rights to privileges. But that's not all. That's just the thing that those of us on the left have gotten angry about. Unfortunately, we haven't properly directed all our ire upon campaign finance laws. To give you an example, I'll play this clip from a video from the Institute for Justice.
A lawsuit was filed against us by one of our political opponents, someone who favored annexation. She demanded that before we speak, we register with the government under Colorado's campaign finance laws. Because we spent more than $200 to speak to our neighbors with things like signs and postage, we became an issue committee under the state's laws. These forms are so complicated that when they were tested on 255 people, not a single person filled them out correctly. In the real world, each person who filled out the form incorrectly would have been subject to fines and penalties, just like we faced. The manual alone telling us how to form an issue committee is 98 pages. 98 pages just telling you how to fill out the forms. And it doesn't end there. Throughout our fight, we would have to file report after report with the government, telling them not only who contributed to our campaign, but forcing us to disclose the name and address of their employer, even if their employer had nothing to do with our campaign.
Because if you look at campaign finance laws, there are multiple instances of this. That's just the one I happen to find most graphically described here. I mean, I've read some stuff in George Will articles, for instance, about the political speech of pro-life groups being suppressed, and that's a pretty notable example. I think it was in Wisconsin, but I'm not sure. But the point of all this is, regardless of the intent of legislation, freedom of speech and freedom of association trump all of that. The fact is that these rights are just that, rights, guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, guaranteed by natural rights theory, guaranteed by utilitarianism, if your utilitarian goal is a functional democratic society rather than an oppressive oligarchy. So these things cannot be relegated to mere privileges that are given out by a bureaucracy that you need to know a ton of legalese to make your way through. Voter disenfranchisement is a bad thing, but an even worse form of disenfranchisement is disenfranchisement from free speech and free association. That is far worse, to my way of thinking. Good day, comrades.